The wind howled through the abandoned streets of the once bustling town, now a ghostly shell of its former self. The St. Joseph Hospital, a looming structure of crumbling brick and shattered windows, stood at the edge of town like a forgotten sentinel. Decades of neglect had left the building scarred, vines snaking up its walls, and darkness seeping from every crack and crevice. Despite the rumors and whispers, the true horror of what had transpired within its walls remained buried, overshadowed by the slow decay of time. Marcus Taylor, the leader of the government's secret paranormal investigation team, stood at the entrance of the hospital, the weight of past failures heavy on his shoulders. The air was thick with unease as he adjusted the strap of his gear, his sharp eyes scanning the building's facade. The old stories had drawn him here, tales of the forgotten nurses and the inexplicable disappearances that had plagued the hospital before its closure. But now, with the unexplained disappearance of a local teenager, the horrors of St. Joseph had clawed their way back into the present. "Looks like we're in for a fun night," Lisa Martinez, the team's tech specialist, muttered as she approached Marcus, her arms full of equipment. Her voice was laced with sarcasm, but there was an underlying tension that betrayed her unease. Marcus offered a grim smile. "You could say that. Let's just hope we find answers before this place swallows us whole." As the rest of the team gathered, Marcus gave the signal, and they moved cautiously through the shattered doors, the darkness of the hospital swallowing them whole. The air inside was stagnant, thick with dust and the scent of decay. Every step echoed ominously in the silence, a constant reminder that they were trespassing in a place where time had stopped. Lisa set up her equipment in what had once been the hospital's reception area, the cracked tiles beneath her feet shifting slightly. "We're getting some strange readings already," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The monitors flickered, displaying erratic spikes in energy levels, and the air around them seemed to hum with an unseen force. Marcus looked around, his gaze narrowing as he noticed the faded bloodstains that still marred the walls. The stories had always hinted at something darker, something beyond the realm of ghosts and spirits. But as he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end, he knew that whatever lurked within these walls was far more sinister. "Let's keep moving," Marcus ordered, leading the team deeper into the hospital. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, the peeling wallpaper and flickering lights creating a disorienting maze. The deeper they went, the colder it became, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Suddenly, a distant echoing scream shattered the silence, freezing the team in their tracks. The sound was unnatural, a mix of human agony and something far more primal. Marcus's heart raced as he gestured for silence, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But they had come too far to retreat now. "We need to find the source of that," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The team pressed on, their breaths visible in the cold air as the hospital itself seemed to come alive around them. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and every corner they turned brought with it a sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And deep within the bowels of the hospital, something stirred, a presence awakened by their intrusion, hungry for more souls to claim. The further they ventured into the hospital, the more it felt like they were walking through a nightmare. The hallways twisted and turned in unnatural ways, leading them in circles and dead ends that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The once sterile smell of antiseptic had long since been replaced by the stench of rot and mold, the air thick with the memories of suffering and death. As they reached what appeared to be the hospital's central ward, Marcus paused, motioning for the team to stop. The room before them was vast, lined with rows of rusted, decaying hospital beds. Each one was covered with dusty, blood-stained sheets, as if the patients had simply vanished, leaving only their suffering behind. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional creak of metal, the remnants of a time long forgotten. Lisa's equipment began to beep frantically, the readings spiking as they entered the room. "Something's not right here," she whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the data. "These energy levels are off the charts. It's like the very walls are alive." As if in response, the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting to a bone-chilling degree. A thick fog began to seep through the cracks in the walls, curling around their feet like ghostly fingers. Marcus could feel the oppressive weight of the building pressing down on him, a suffocating presence that seemed to worm its way into his mind. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned sharply, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog, but there was nothing there. Just the endless rows of beds, and the darkness that seemed to creep ever closer. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again, a shadowy figure, just beyond the reach of his light. He turned to face it, but the figure was gone, leaving only an imprint of its presence in the air, a whisper of something malevolent. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that they were not alone in this room. The forgotten nurses, the spirits trapped within these walls, were watching them, waiting. Without warning, one of the beds in the corner of the room moved, its rusted frame screeching against the floor. The sheet on top of it slid off, revealing the skeletal remains of a long-dead patient, their empty eye sockets staring into nothingness. A sense of dread washed over the team as they realized that this was no ordinary haunting. The spirits here were not merely lost souls. They were trapped in a cycle of torment, their pain and suffering feeding the darkness that lurked in the hospital's shadows. As the team gathered around the bed, the air grew heavy with the sound of distant whispers, voices echoing through the room. They were faint at first, barely audible, but grew louder with each passing second, filling the room with a cacophony of tortured wails and moans. Lisa's equipment began to malfunction, the screens flickering wildly before shutting down completely. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling as she backed away from the bed. "Whatever's in this place, it's not something we can fight." But before they could retreat, the doors to the ward slammed shut, trapping them inside. The fog thickened, and the shadows grew darker, closing in around them. The air was filled with the sound of approaching footsteps, as if the very walls of the hospital were coming to life. And in that moment, Marcus knew they had made a grave mistake. They had awakened something ancient, something evil, and now there was no escape. The forgotten nurses, twisted by years of torment and suffering, were coming for them, and they would not rest until the team joined them in their eternal nightmare. The air in the ward seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment, pressing down on Marcus and his team like an invisible weight. The once dim light of their flashlights now flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows on the walls that seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. The whispers had become an omnipresent hum, threading through the air and into their minds, planting seeds of unease and paranoia. Marcus took a step back, his eyes darting to the doors that had slammed shut, now sealed tight as if by some unseen force. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained steady. "We need to stay calm. There has to be another way out." Lisa was hunched over her equipment, frantically trying to reboot the systems, her hands shaking as she worked. "I've never seen anything like this," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "It's like the hospital itself is alive." Before Marcus could respond, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the ward. The team spun around, their flashlights converging on the source of the noise. One of the beds had been overturned, its metal frame twisted and mangled as if by a great force. The sheet that had once covered it was now draped across the floor, soaked in a dark, viscous liquid that glistened ominously in the faint light. "Did you see that?" David, the team's muscle, whispered, his normally steady hands trembling as he gripped his flashlight tighter. Something moved. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to peer through the dense fog that clung to the floor like a shroud. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the back of his throat. And then, from the darkness, it emerged. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague, indistinct shape that seemed to waver in and out of existence. But as it drew closer, it solidified into something far more terrifying. The figure was tall and gaunt, its skin a sickly gray, stretched taut over sharp, angular bones. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, piercing through the darkness like twin points of fire. It wore the tattered remnants of a nurse's uniform, now stained with blood and grime, its once pristine white fabric turned a sickly yellow. The creature moved with a fluid, almost graceful motion, gliding across the floor as if it were weightless. Its long, bony fingers twitched and flexed, the nails elongated into sharp, deadly claws that gleamed in the light. "Back away, slowly," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible as the creature drew nearer. His heart raced, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he knew that any sudden movement could provoke an attack. But just as the team began to retreat, the creature let out a low, guttural hiss, its eyes narrowing as it locked onto Marcus. In that instant, the room was filled with a deafening screech, the sound so piercing that it felt as if their eardrums would burst. The fog around them seemed to come alive, swirling violently as the creature lunged forward, its claws outstretched and ready to strike. Marcus barely had time to react, diving to the side as the creature's claws slashed through the air where he had stood just moments before. The team scattered, their flashlights swinging wildly as they tried to evade the creature's attacks. But it was relentless, moving with inhuman speed and precision, its movements a blur of dark intent. Lisa screamed as the creature's claws raked across her arm, tearing through her jacket and leaving deep, bloody gashes in her flesh. She stumbled back, clutching her wounded arm as the creature loomed over her, ready to strike again. But before it could, Marcus sprang into action, grabbing a nearby metal pipe and swinging it with all his strength. The pipe connected with a sickening crack, and the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek, recoiling as the blow sent it staggering backward. Its form wavered, flickering like a dying flame, before it dissolved into the fog, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Breathing heavily, Marcus turned to his team. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as they rushed toward the door, the fog began to thicken, coiling around their legs like chains, pulling them deeper into the hospital's clutches. And from the darkness, more figures began to emerge, their glowing eyes and twisted forms a nightmarish reflection of the hospital's long-forgotten past. The team pushed through the fog, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital. The walls seemed to close in around them, the once familiar architecture of the building warping and twisting into something unrecognizable. The shadows were alive with movement, figures darting just out of sight, their presence felt but never fully seen. "Where the hell are we?" David muttered, his voice tight with fear as he glanced around. "This isn't the way we came. It's like the building's changing around us," Lisa replied, clutching her wounded arm. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, darting from shadow to shadow as if expecting another attack at any moment. "This place, it's not just haunted. It's alive." Marcus kept his focus ahead, leading the way with a grim determination. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what they were experiencing, but nothing added up. The hospital's layout was shifting, the walls and hallways transforming into a maze designed to trap them. He could feel the malevolent force growing stronger with each step, a dark presence that seemed to feed off their fear. As they turned another corner, they found themselves standing at the top of a staircase leading down into the basement. The steps were cracked and worn, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Faint, echoing voices drifted up from the darkness below, the same whispers they had heard earlier, but now louder, more insistent. "We have to go down," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the unease gnawing at his gut. "Whatever's controlling this place, it's down there." Lisa hesitated, her grip tightening on her equipment. "Are you sure? It feels like we're walking into a trap." Marcus nodded, his expression resolute. "I'm sure, but it's the only way forward. We need to find out what's really going on here, and the answers are down there." Taking a deep breath, the team began their descent into the basement. The walls were lined with rusted pipes that dripped with foul-smelling water, the sound echoing through the narrow stairwell like a death knell. The darkness grew thicker with each step, the cold seeping into their bones. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a long, narrow corridor lined with heavy metal doors. The air was thick with the scent of rot and something else, something acrid and metallic that stung their nostrils. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, their meaning lost to time. "This place gives me the creeps," David whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. "Feels like we're walking into a horror movie." Marcus didn't respond, his focus on the doors that lined the corridor. Each one was marked with a different number, but the numbers didn't seem to follow any logical sequence. Some were scratched out, while others were smeared with the same dark substance as the symbols on the walls. They stopped in front of one door that stood out from the rest. It was larger, more imposing, and the number on it was barely visible, obscured by deep gouges as if something had tried to claw its way out. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice low. He reached for the door, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped the cold metal handle. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and a wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the stench of death and decay. Inside, the room was pitch black, the darkness so thick it felt almost tangible, like a living entity pressing in on them from all sides. As they stepped inside, their flashlights flickered, the beams struggling to pierce the darkness. The room was vast, far larger than it should have been, the walls stretching out into infinity. And in the center of the room stood a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her body was gaunt, her skin pale and translucent, stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck in the light. She wore the remnants of a nurse's uniform, now tattered and stained with blood. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her hands outstretched as if reaching for something or someone. Before anyone could react, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside with the ghostly figure. The air grew colder, the darkness closing in around them as the woman began to move, her steps slow and deliberate, each one echoing through the room like a death knell. And as she drew closer, Marcus realized with a sinking feeling that there was no way out. They had walked right into the heart of the hospital's darkness, and now it was too late to escape. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the soft shuffle of the ghostly nurse's feet as she moved closer. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of dread that seeped into their bones. The team stood frozen, their flashlights flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness, as if even the light was too afraid to fully illuminate the horrors hidden within. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing. The figure before them was more than just a ghost. She was a manifestation of the hospital's malevolent spirit, an embodiment of the pain and suffering that had festered within its walls for decades. And now, that darkness was reaching out to claim them. "We need to move," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "Slowly. Don't provoke her." But as they began to inch backward, the nurse let out a low, guttural moan that reverberated through the room like a death rattle. Her hollow eyes locked onto them, and with a sudden, jerky movement, she lunged forward, her outstretched hands grasping at the air. Lisa screamed, stumbling backward as the ghost's cold, clammy fingers brushed against her skin. The contact sent a jolt of icy fear through her, freezing her in place. Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her away just as the nurse's hand closed around empty air. "Run," he shouted, his voice breaking through the paralyzing fear that gripped the team. They turned and bolted toward the far end of the room, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. But no matter how fast they ran, the darkness seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls closing in around them like a vice. David stumbled, his foot catching on something unseen in the dark. He fell hard, his flashlight skittering across the floor and spinning wildly, casting chaotic beams of light that danced across the walls. Marcus and Lisa skidded to a stop, rushing back to help him up, but as they did, the room suddenly shifted. The walls began to pulse, the strange symbols glowing with a sickly, greenish light that filled the room with an eerie, otherworldly glow. The air grew thick with the scent of burning flesh, and the whispers, the incessant, maddening whispers, grew louder, filling their minds with a cacophony of voices that spoke in a language they couldn't understand. "What the hell is happening?" David gasped, his eyes wide with terror as he scrambled to his feet. "I don't know." Marcus shouted over the din, his voice barely audible above the growing noise. "But we have to keep moving." But as they turned to flee, the nurse appeared before them once more, her form now flickering and distorted, as if she were struggling to maintain her shape. Her mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and a torrent of black smoke poured out, filling the room with a choking, acrid cloud that stung their eyes and burned their throats. The smoke coiled around them, pulling them deeper into the darkness, and as they struggled to breathe, Marcus felt a cold hand close around his wrist. He looked down, his heart lurching in his chest as he saw the nurse's skeletal fingers wrapped tightly around him, pulling him toward her. "No," he screamed, fighting against the inhuman strength that dragged him closer. But it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too powerful, and as he was pulled into the suffocating void, the last thing he heard was the sound of Lisa's voice, calling out his name in a desperate, terrified plea. And then, there was nothing but darkness. Marcus awoke to a cold, damp sensation beneath him. The ground was hard and uneven, pressing into his back as he lay sprawled out in the darkness. His head throbbed with a dull pain, and his body ached from the strain of being pulled through the void. He opened his eyes, but all he could see was black, a thick, impenetrable darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if they were weighed down by some unseen force. Panic began to set in as he realized he was alone, the silence around him absolute. The whispers that had plagued them earlier were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that pressed in on him from all sides. "Lisa? David?" His voice was weak, barely more than a croak, but there was no response. The darkness swallowed his words, leaving him with nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing. Gathering what little strength he had left, Marcus forced himself to sit up. His head spun, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out again, but he pushed through the dizziness, focusing on the feel of the cold, damp ground beneath his hands. It was rough, like stone, and covered in a thin layer of slime that made his skin crawl. He reached for his flashlight, but it was gone, lost somewhere in the void. He cursed under his breath, feeling around in the darkness for anything he could use to get his bearings, but there was nothing. just endless, empty blackness. Then, faintly, he heard it, a soft, distant sound that sent a shiver down his spine. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a massive heart, echoing through the darkness. It was coming from somewhere deep below, reverberating through the ground beneath him. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling with the effort. The sound grew louder as he stood, vibrating up through his feet and into his chest. It was an unnatural sound, something that didn't belong in this world, and it filled him with a deep, primal fear. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling with the effort to remain calm. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer, but the thumping continued, growing louder with each passing moment. It was as if the very ground beneath him was alive, pulsing with some dark, malevolent energy. And then, from the darkness, a faint, pale light began to glow, illuminating the rough stone walls around him. He was in a tunnel, the walls damp and glistening with moisture, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. The light was coming from far ahead, a flickering, ghostly glow that beckoned him forward, pulling him toward it like a moth to a flame. Marcus hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to run as far from that light as possible. But there was nowhere else to go, no other path to take. He was trapped in this nightmare, and the only way out was through. Taking a deep breath, he began to move toward the light, his footsteps echoing through the tunnel. The thumping grew louder with each step, shaking the walls and making the ground tremble beneath him. He could feel it in his bones, a deep, resonant hum that set his teeth on edge. As he drew closer to the light, he saw that it was coming from an opening in the tunnel wall, a rough-hewn doorway that led into a chamber beyond. The light flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and the thumping was louder now, almost deafening. He stepped through the doorway, into the light, and found himself in a vast, circular chamber. The walls were lined with strange, pulsating veins that glowed with an unnatural light, and at the center of the room was the source of the thumping, a massive, dark shape that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat. It was a heart, an enormous, grotesque heart that hung suspended in the air, its surface slick with blood and bile. It throbbed with a sickening rhythm, each beat sending a shudder through the chamber and making the walls tremble. And standing before it, bathed in the heart's eerie light, was the nurse. She was no longer the gaunt, ghostly figure they had encountered earlier. She had grown, her body twisted and deformed, her eyes glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. Her hands were outstretched, her fingers curled into claws, and as she turned to face Marcus, she let out a low, guttural growl that echoed through the chamber. Marcus took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He was trapped, caught in the grip of the hospital's darkness, and there was no escape. The nurse's growl echoed through the chamber, a haunting sound that reverberated off the pulsating walls. Marcus stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the abomination before him. The grotesque heart at the chamber's center continued to throb, each beat sending ripples of unnatural energy through the air. He could feel it vibrating through his bones, shaking him to his core. The nurse stepped closer, her twisted form moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Her eyes, glowing with a malevolent light, locked onto Marcus, and he felt an overwhelming wave of despair crash over him. It was as if the very essence of the hospital's tortured past had coalesced into this horrific creature, and it was now focused entirely on him. Marcus. The nurse's voice was a guttural whisper, distorted and otherworldly. It was filled with pain, anger, and a deep, consuming hunger. "You cannot escape." Her words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He glanced around, searching for any means of escape, but the chamber offered none. The only exit was the tunnel he had come from, but the nurse was between him and it, and there was no way he could outrun her in his weakened state. Desperation began to claw at the edges of his mind. He had to do something, anything, before the nurse could reach him. His eyes fell on the pulsating heart at the center of the chamber. It was grotesque and terrifying, but it was also clearly a source of power. If he could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, he could break the nurse's hold on the hospital and save himself. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Marcus lunged toward the heart. The nurse shrieked, a high-pitched wail that nearly caused him to stumble, but he pressed on. His hand reached out, fingers just inches away from the pulsing mass, when a cold, bony hand clamped down on his wrist, stopping him in his tracks. No! The nurse's voice was filled with rage as she yanked him backward, throwing him to the ground with terrifying strength. Marcus hit the floor hard, pain exploding in his side as he skidded to a stop. Gasping for breath, he looked up to see the nurse standing over him, her eyes blazing with fury. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," she hissed, her voice echoing in the chamber. "The suffering here, it is eternal. You will become part of it." She raised her clawed hand, preparing to strike, and Marcus knew he had only seconds to act. In a last-ditch effort, he grabbed a loose piece of stone from the floor and hurled it at the heart with all his strength. The stone struck its mark, and the heart shuddered violently, its pulsations growing erratic. The nurse let out a blood-curdling scream as the heart began to rupture, spewing forth a thick, black ichor that splattered across the chamber walls. The veins in the walls started to glow brighter, pulsating wildly as if in sync with the heart's death throes. The nurse stumbled, her form flickering as the light in her eyes began to fade. "No!" She cried out, her voice filled with a mixture of rage and despair. "You cannot stop the suffering." With one final, agonized wail, the nurse disintegrated into a cloud of black smoke, which was quickly absorbed by the collapsing heart. The chamber shook violently as the heart continued to disintegrate, the walls crumbling and the ground beneath Marcus's feet beginning to give way. He scrambled to his feet, fighting through the pain as he made a desperate dash for the tunnel. The chamber was falling apart around him, chunks of stone crashing down as the heart imploded, taking with it the darkness that had plagued the hospital for so long. Marcus didn't look back. He ran, his only focus on escaping the collapsing nightmare behind him. As he reached the tunnel, the ground beneath him gave one final shudder, and the chamber collapsed entirely, sealing itself off with a deafening crash. Marcus stumbled through the tunnel, gasping for breath as the dust and debris settled around him. He was bruised, battered, and utterly exhausted, but he was alive. And for the first time since entering St. Joseph's, the darkness felt lighter. The tunnel stretched out before Marcus, its walls no longer pulsating with that sickly, greenish light. Instead, a dull, gray glow seeped in from somewhere far ahead. The oppressive darkness that had hung over the hospital seemed to have lifted, replaced by a deathly stillness. But Marcus knew better than to let his guard down. This place still held secrets, and there was no telling what other horrors might lurk in its depths. As he limped forward, his body aching from the ordeal, Marcus tried to piece together what had just happened. The heart, the source of all the malevolence in the hospital, had been destroyed, but at what cost? The nurse's final words echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread. Had he truly ended the suffering, or had he merely unleashed something far worse? The tunnel began to widen, and soon, Marcus found himself standing at the entrance to another chamber. This one was much smaller than the one he had just escaped from, its walls lined with crumbling bricks that looked centuries old. In the center of the room stood a large, rusted metal door, its surface covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Marcus hesitated. The symbols looked familiar, similar to the ones he had seen earlier in the hospital. They seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly energy, and as he stared at them, he felt a sharp pain in his head, as if something was trying to claw its way into his mind. Shaking off the sensation, Marcus reached out and touched the door. It was cold to the touch, and as his fingers brushed against the symbols, they flared with a bright, blinding light. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led upward into darkness. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to climb the stairs. Each step was agonizing, his legs protesting with every movement, but he forced himself to keep going. He had to get out of this place, to escape whatever nightmares still awaited him. He couldn't allow himself to give up now, not when he was so close. The staircase seemed to stretch on forever, winding upward through the darkness. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, and soon, his breath was visible in the frigid air. The light from his flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls, but he pressed on, his mind focused solely on reaching the top. Finally, after what felt like hours, Marcus reached the top of the staircase. Before him was another door, this one made of heavy wood, its surface cracked and splintered with age. He pushed it open, and a rush of cold, fresh air hit him in the face. He stepped through the door and found himself standing in the middle of a dense forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The ground beneath his feet was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, and the sky above was a dull, overcast gray. For a moment, Marcus just stood there, taking in the sight of the outside world. It felt surreal, like he had stepped out of one reality and into another. The horrors of the hospital seemed like a distant memory, something that belonged to a different time and place. But as he took a step forward, he felt a strange sensation in the pit of his stomach, a sense of unease that told him that this was far from over. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, which had somehow survived the ordeal. He turned it on, hoping to find some signal, but the screen remained dark. With a frustrated sigh, he pocketed it again and started walking, unsure of where he was going or what he would find. As he made his way through the forest, the trees began to thin out, and soon, he found himself standing at the edge of a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated old building, its roof caved in and its walls covered in ivy. The air around it felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He knew this place. It was the old chapel, the one that had been closed down years ago after the fire. The one that had been rumored to be haunted by the spirits of the nuns who had died inside. The one that had been connected to the hospital by a network of underground tunnels. And as Marcus stood there, staring at the crumbling ruins, he realized with a sinking feeling that his nightmare was far from over. The curse of St. Joseph's had followed him here, to this forsaken place, and whatever lay in wait inside the chapel was far worse than anything he had faced in the hospital. With a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, Marcus took a step forward, knowing that his journey was not yet complete. The old chapel loomed before Marcus, its decrepit structure exuding a malevolent energy that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the trees around him seemed to bend inward, as if trying to contain the evil within. Marcus hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but something deep inside compelled him forward. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The door to the chapel creaked open with a sound that sent shivers down Marcus's spine. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the narrow slits where the roof had caved in. Shadows danced across the walls, forming grotesque shapes that twisted and writhed as if alive. Marcus's breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped inside, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath his weight. As he ventured deeper into the chapel, Marcus noticed strange symbols etched into the walls and floor, similar to those he had seen in the hospital's heart chamber. They glowed faintly, their light casting an eerie pallor over the room. At the far end of the chapel stood an altar, draped in a tattered cloth that fluttered in an unseen breeze. Above it, a massive, weathered crucifix hung askew, its figure of Christ looking more tormented than ever before. Marcus approached the altar, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He could feel the oppressive energy intensifying with every step, as if the very air was thickening around him. The altar seemed to vibrate with a dark power, and as he reached out to touch it, the symbols on the floor flared to life, casting the room in a sickly green glow. Suddenly, the chapel's walls began to tremble, and the floor beneath Marcus's feet cracked open, revealing a gaping abyss. The darkness below seemed to pull at him, its depth unfathomable. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The chapel was collapsing around him, the ceiling caving in, and the walls crumbling to dust. Out of the abyss, a figure began to rise, a tall, shadowy form draped in flowing black robes. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Marcus could feel its eyes boring into him, piercing through his soul. The figure reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers curling as if beckoning him closer. "You cannot escape, Marcus," the figure intoned, its voice a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the chapel. "The curse is eternal, and you are part of it now." Marcus shook his head, backing away from the edge of the abyss. "No, I won't be part of this," he stammered, his voice trembling. But even as he spoke, he could feel the pull of the abyss, a dark, insidious force that threatened to drag him down into the depths. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "You have seen the suffering," it whispered, its voice echoing in his mind. "You have felt the pain, and now you must embrace it." With a sudden surge of defiance, Marcus grabbed the rusted crucifix from the altar and hurled it at the figure. The crucifix struck the shadowy form, and for a moment, the chapel was filled with a blinding light. The figure let out a piercing scream, its form dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that was quickly sucked back into the abyss. The light intensified, and the chapel began to shake violently. The walls crumbled away, and the abyss widened, swallowing everything in its path. Marcus fell to his knees, his vision blurring as the light grew brighter and brighter, until it consumed everything. And then there was nothing. When Marcus awoke, he was lying on cold, hard ground. His body ached, and his head throbbed with a dull pain. He groaned as he sat up, blinking against the harsh light that flooded his vision. As his eyes adjusted, he realized he was no longer in the chapel. He was outside, in the middle of a barren, desolate landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, and the air was thick with the scent of burning ash. There were no trees, no buildings, nothing but endless, cracked earth. Marcus stood on shaky legs, looking around in confusion. Where was he? How had he gotten here? He turned in a slow circle, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no sign of the chapel, no sign of the abyss, only the desolate wasteland. Panic began to set in as he realized he was completely alone. Had he been dragged into some other dimension? Was this the afterlife? Or was it some kind of twisted purgatory, a place where he was doomed to wander for eternity? As he struggled to make sense of his surroundings, a faint sound reached his ears, a low, rhythmic thumping, like the distant beat of a drum. He turned toward the sound, squinting through the haze, and saw a figure approaching from the horizon. The figure was tall and thin, its movements slow and deliberate. As it drew closer, Marcus could make out more details, a ragged cloak that billowed in the wind, and a face obscured by a hood. The figure stopped a few feet away, and Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It was the same shadowy form he had seen in the chapel, but now it seemed even more ethereal, its body flickering like a dying flame. The figure raised its head, and for the first time, Marcus saw its face, or what was left of it. The skin was stretched tight over a skeletal frame, the eyes sunken and hollow, glowing with an eerie light. "Where am I?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaky. "What is this place?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering his question. "You are beyond the veil," it replied, its voice a soft whisper that carried on the wind. "The place between life and death, where the lost souls wander." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "How do I get out of here?" The figure's eyes seemed to bore into him, and it took a step closer. "There is no escape, Marcus. You are part of the curse now, bound to this place for all eternity. But you are not alone. The others will join you soon." Marcus shook his head, backing away. No, this can't be happening." The figure raised a bony hand, and the ground beneath Marcus's feet began to tremble. Cracks spidered out from where he stood, and he could feel the pull of the abyss once more, dragging him down into the darkness. He screamed, but there was no one to hear him. The last thing he saw before the ground gave way was the figure's hollow eyes, glowing with a sinister light. And then, everything went black. When Marcus opened his eyes again, he was standing in the middle of the barren wasteland, the same desolate landscape stretching out before him. The sky was dark, the air thick with ash, and in the distance, he could see a figure approaching, a tall, thin form, shrouded in a ragged cloak. The cycle had begun again, and this time, there would be no escape.